Imagine a time when the Iberian Peninsula was a fierce battlefield where Christian kingdoms and a powerful caliphate fought for total dominance. In the arid lands of Alarcos, two colossal armies faced each other in a battle that would become Castilla's greatest disaster, a challenge that echoed across Europe. This isn't just a story, it's an epic of honor, blood, and power that will leave you breathless.
In the year 1177, the troops of Castile had taken Cuenca, leaving the political map of the peninsula. In this way, we have the Kingdom of Leon, the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Navarre, the Kingdom of Portugal, and the Crown of Aragon. To the south of the Christian kingdoms was the Almohad Empire, which was a caliphate that had replaced the Almoravids. In the year 1190, the caliph was Al-Mansur, also known as Yusuf II, who made a truce with Alfonso VIII to stop the Christian advance. However, shortly after, he had to go to Africa to quell a series of revolts that had broken out in the north, in the region of Mauritania, and of course he marched with the bulk of his army to pacify his lands. Alfonso took advantage of the truce to build a castle in Alarcos, a hill in no man's land, located in a strategic place, would be a support point to continue the reconquest to the south. The question is, would he be able to continue defeating the Almohads? In the year 1194, he ordered the Archbishop of Toledo to launch a raid against the Almohad Empire. The troops attacked the outskirts of Jaén, Córdoba, and even Seville itself, taking treasures and animals, devastating everything in their path. Of course, Al-Mansur was angry and threatened with a great reprimand on Christian territory. And do you know what Alfonso did? What did he respond to the Almohad? Well, nothing more and nothing less than he challenged him to land with his army on the peninsula, to face the Castilian troops. And the best part is that he told him that if he didn't dare to go to the peninsula, he demanded that the Almohads give him a fleet to embark his troops and land with his men in Africa to confront the Almohads there. Amazing. Of course, this Castilian arrogance did not sit well with the Caliph, who responded, I quote literally, "I will pounce on them and turn them into dust, using armies they have never seen and from whose strength they will not be able to escape." His army and his officers supported the response and cried out for revenge. He gathered the troops from Africa, marched to the north coast of the continent, and there embarked on the Almohad fleet. He headed to Tarifa and disembarked with his troops nearby. But it wasn't enough, he wanted more. In Al-Andalus, he called for levies, and many civilians joined his ranks, as they felt outraged by the looting and slaughter they had been subjected to by the Christian troops. In the end, between infantry, cavalry, archers, logistics, and mercenaries, he gathered about 30,000 men. Weeks later, he departed for Córdoba, where more troops joined him. Notably, the troops of Pedro Fernández de Castro, lord of the House of Castro, who had left the Christian kingdoms due to his enmity with the monarchs, joined him. And he went on to serve the Almohads as a mercenary. On July 4th, the Almohad troops went to war. Alfonso, when he saw the threat looming over his domains, gathered all his troops in Toledo. And
Of course,
he asked for help from the kings of Leon, Navarre, and Aragon. Only the union of all Christian kingdoms could defeat the Almohads. But without waiting for reinforcements, the Castilian troops marched to Alarcos. And what was in Alarcos? Well, a half-built fortress at the southern end of the Kingdom of Castile, from which a wide territory was dominated, and above all, access to the Tagus Valley was protected. The 17th of July, the Castilian troops arrived at Alarcos alone, and could glimpse the great army on the horizon. Almohad. According to the Chronicle of Rebus Hispaniae, the Almohad army was innumerable like a tide of people. Approaching Alarcos on July 18th, the Almohad troops arrived near Alarcos. But there were so many that the Caliph decided to wait until the next day, so that even the last of his men could have reached the meeting point. Let's go back for a moment to the campaign map. The Leonese troops were already in Talavera, a few days' march from Alarcos, so if Alfonso retreated, he could increase the size of his army. The troops from Navarre and Aragon were on their way, so it was possible that they would arrive in Talavera on time. And even at worst, they could give up more ground until they met up with them. However, Alfonso decided to fight. On the 19th of July, as the sun rose, both armies formed face to face. The Castilian army had infantry and cavalry. The chronicles do not mention projectile units as such. Alfonso formed the infantry into a thick battlefront, between 10,000 and 15,000 men. While in front, he positioned his heavy cavalry, which totaled around 10,000 knights, a brutal figure for the time. Among these were members of the orders of Santiago de Calatrava and Ebora. The masters of each order were present, and the cavalry was led by Diego Lopez de Haro. On the Saracen side, the army of 30,000 warriors was divided into 5 bodies. In the vanguard were volunteers, levies, units of little experience and therefore of little value, so that they would be the ones to receive the full brunt of the Christian charge. Behind these, in the center, was the infantry of the Caliphate, regular troops with experience. And in reserve was Al-Mansur himself, along with his personal guard, also known as the Black Guard, made up of Mauritanians and Senegalese. On both flanks, the light cavalry. I note that in the sources I have only read references to the Christian cavalry, and vaguely about the infantry. The role of the Castilian infantry is unclear. I will create a narrative that closely reflects reality. And by the way, the issue of figures will always be under question. And before we continue, I want you to carefully analyze the formation of each side. Do you see it as appropriate? Leave your opinion in the comments and we'll discuss it. The fact of putting the cavalry at the forefront makes the clash brutal, but of course the flanks
are exposed.
So if the enemy has cavalry, they can flank us. It's a common strategy in the era, this one of betting everything on a heavy cavalry frontal charge, a strategy that I personally do not share. And now let's continue. The order was given and the Castilian heavy cavalry began to advance at a trot. Soon a dust cloud began to rise, given the number of knights advancing at a trot towards enemy positions. They reached a prudent distance, reformed the front on the go, and another order was given to charge. The Castilians galloped forward, lowered their lances, tightened their legs against their mounts, gripped their shields tightly, and let themselves go. It was a thrilling clash. The Muslim lines, composed of levies and volunteers mixed with some warriors, were crushed. Soon the screams flooded the battlefield, but when the dust settled, the Saracen vanguard was still holding its positions. Diego de Haro ordered the retreat. They moved away from the enemy, reformed the front, and when they were ready, they launched into a gallop again. Another charge. More dead. The Almohad line began to curve inward, giving the appearance that it was going to break, but it was only appearance. Again, the cavalry charge failed to break the front. And of course, doubts began to enter the heads of the Castilians, that if they couldn't handle the mere volunteers, what would happen with the regular troops? The cavalry moved away again and began to form another front, ready to deliver the final blow to the enemy vanguard. But then there was movement in the army. Almohad, the light cavalry Saracen, advanced hastily. Diego de Haro ordered all the knights to charge against the enemy's right wing. If they managed to put them to flight, they could surround the enemy army and crush them. That could have happened if the Castilian infantry had been nearby. Alfonso, seeing what was happening, probably ordered half of his pawns to advance. They had to charge against the enemy center so that their cavalry would not be surrounded. But then, as they advanced, the enemy's left flank drew their bows and from their mounts began to assail the Christian infantry. They were forced to form in tight formations with their shields raised to avoid being hit. The trap was set. The Almohad infantry began to advance. They had already been fighting for 2 hours and the Christian cavalry was beginning to show signs of fatigue. The Almohad archers began to open fire over the heads of their pawns, riddling the mass of Castilian cavalry that had bunched up in front of the Almohad cavalry. Meanwhile, the Caliphate's infantry was surrounding the Christian knights while attacking them. The Christian reinforcements are helpless. They couldn't advance without losing people. But of course it was necessary to get there to help the cavalry, or would it be completely annihilated? They continued to advance slowly, but then the experienced troops of the Caliphate came into play. All of these launched against the Castilian knights, practically finishing surrounding them. Then the Muslim left flank abandoned the harassment of Alfonso's infantry. He galloped to the right flank and charged against the only free gap that remained from the siege to the Castilian cavalry. The Christians were surrounded. At this moment, Alfonso began to lose control over his pawns, and they began to panic, and the desire to flee spread among their ranks. Part of the Castilian infantry left the battlefield, while Alfonso decided to fortify himself in the castle of Alarcos, or at least what had been built of it. The Castilian knights were being massacred by the Almohad projectiles, while the siege was getting tighter and tighter. Several hours had passed since the battle began and the Christian cavalry couldn't take it anymore. They were exhausted, surrounded, and demoralized. Diego de Haro, leading a handful of knights, managed to break the siege and escape at a gallop, heading to the castle, where he intended to establish the last line of defense. The rest of his knights died in combat. Upon reaching the castle, they convinced Alfonso to flee, and he, shocked by the defeat to which he had led his men, took his horse and fled north. Minutes later, the Almohads surrounded the castle. The Christian troops had no morale to fight, and after a precious time that allowed the Castilian monarch to escape, they surrendered. This battle resonated throughout Europe, as what had so far been a victorious reconquest had turned into a disaster of such magnitudes that could allow Muslims to penetrate into France through the Pyrenees. Without troops that could stop them, the Almohads had a clear path to reconquer Toledo. However, it did not happen that way. For the moment, the Almohad Caliph was content with devastating the border with the Christian kingdoms in the Tagus Valley. They would soon invade the kingdom of Castile. Or so he thought. And in the year 1199, the Caliph would die. And his son? Instead of continuing to advance north, he preferred peace with the Christians to crush the Almoravid rebels who were trying to re-establish their caliphate after his mistake. It would be 13 years later, in the lands of Jaén, where the most important battle of Christianity against Islam to date would take place. Would it mark a turning point in the reconquest that in the future Muslim in the Iberian Peninsula? 13 years later, Castilians, Aragonese, Navarrese, Occitans, Leonese, Portuguese, and French, as well as Templar Knights, Hospitallers of the Order of Santiago and Calatrava, would join forces to confront the Caliphate. Next chapter, the Navas de Tolosa.